Thank you, guys. That was good. It's always good. It's good to be here. It's good to take this opportunity. It's horrible not being able to see you. Sorry, I'm just so used to that. But I suppose that's recreating a little bit the atmosphere or the thing that we got when we were doing the online church. So, but because I'm here, I have to wear my good pants. Oh, don't worry about it. It's all right. There we go. So we're in the last chapter of the book of Ephesians, and I too have really enjoyed this series. It's been great to just walk our way through this really important letter that Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus. And last week, Henrik talked about relationships, and particularly focused on that idea of what happens in a marriage and how a marriage and the between a husband and wife kind of reflects or should reflect the marriage between Christ and the church, and looked at some of those relationships. And so tonight, this last chapter, I've called it Stand Strong, because I want to focus on the second half of the chapter. But the first half, I just want to quickly, I guess, say, just follows on from that idea that Henrik brought to us last week. So last week it was really about husbands and wives, and then because somebody's divided it into chapters somehow or other at some stage and put chapters and verses and all that sort of thing just to make it easier to find where we were throughout the Bible. So someone put the chapters and verses in, and so they've sort of, kind of divided up kind of evenly. And sometimes the thoughts don't always flow across those chapters. And that's what's happened in this case between chapter 5 and chapter 6. There's this sense of, Paul is talking about relationships. So he's gone husbands and wives, fathers or parents and children, and then slaves and masters, or employees and employers. Sometimes it feels a bit the same way, I recognise. And it's really just talking about those relationships and how we relate to each other in those things. And it tries to paint a bit of a new way to say that don't just always go with what the world talks about and the sort of standards that the world has for those relationships, but really think about it in a new light. And as we looked at that whole thing before, about that summary of the whole book of Ephesians, it talked about in the second half that we look at everything in our lives in a new way when we look at it through Jesus. So there's this idea of the gospel, and then Jesus has this impact on our lives. Now, I was going to get the whiteboard out and do little drawings like that too, as I was going through tonight, but I'm the worst drawer in the world. So you'd get one little stick figure that wouldn't really help very much at all. So there's a couple of things that just to point out in this. It says, children, if you want to be wise, listen to your parents. And I think that's all I want to say tonight. I'm not looking at anyone in particular. You just happen to be sitting in the front row there, Mads, right in front of my line of sight. But it's an interesting little thought that it picks up. It goes on to say, for the commandment, honour your father and mother, was the first of the 10 commandments with a promise attached. You will prosper and live a long, full life if you honour your parents. Well, sounds good. But it's not all about just, all right, so it's all about the kids and doing the right thing. But there's a really interesting little piece of advice that Paul gives, particularly to fathers. Fathers, don't exasperate your children, but raise them up with loving discipline and counsel. Settle down, everybody. All you kids here tonight, looking at your parents. So it's just about how it's reminding us that our parents and that will be parents, that you need to be careful about the way that you raise them. You don't make life too hard for your kids. Don't make it impossible and exasperate your kids. Don't set standards and make it impossible to reach those things. You've got to work together in those sort of things. And it talks about loving discipline and counsel that brings the revelation of our Lord. So, it's not just about the behaviour standards or those sort of things. It's about sharing God's love in your family as well. So it was in the marriage partnership, it was in between children and parents and children. And then it goes on to talk a little bit too about how you work in the world. So they talk about masters and slaves because that was the reality of life back then, that there was both masters and slaves in the church. So often we would hear the phrase that someone and their whole household came to Jesus or became Christians. So when it talks about the whole household, that includes all of the servants and the slaves and everyone in the household was brought along into the faith. So it must have been interesting. I don't think we'll fully understand what it was like for slaves, and I don't think we understand really what slavery was like back then as well. We might have a concept of that, but I've got a feeling it might have been a little bit different. It probably was more an employee-employer sort of relationship. I don't know, but I know that people were beholden to their masters, and so often decisions were made on their behalf. So I wonder how those slaves sort of felt about that. But it does talk again about just respecting each other in all those relationships, respect and love. Kirsten this morning talked about love and truth, and I think when you put all those things together, it really is about how we relate to each other and the way that we say things to each other as well. And I think that was a really important point that Kirsten raised this morning. That it's really good to tell the truth to someone, but sometimes it's not always the right time and place to tell that truth. Sometimes we need to hold back on those things. That's kind of what I heard you say. Kirsten's going, did I really say that? So, it's about how we relate to people and all of those sort of things. And he says, and to the caretakers of the flock, I say, do what is right with your people, forgiving them when they offend you, for you know there's a master in heaven that shows no favouritism. So, it's about forgiveness, it's about relating to people, it's about getting on together, and that's all sort of flowing on from that sense of unity. Now, I'm going to flick over here into this little part. So, as I said, it's all about love. And then I was interested that they picked up in the little presentation, and Jono picked up on it when he did it. There was a key word at the start of chapter 4 that said, therefore. So all of the stuff that came before sort of was now leading into somewhere different. And there's another sort of key word that Paul has that uses here in this part of chapter 6. So we get partway down, we've talked about all these relationships, and then he goes, and now a final word. So a final word, it's sort of go, oh, okay, he's coming to the end. But sometimes that final word is a really key part of what someone wants to say. I love watching detective shows, and we quite like Death in Paradise. I don't know if anyone likes that one. There's... And I don't know whether you've noticed, but almost all of the guys that were in that, they do their questioning, the detectives. There's been a series of different detectives in that. And they'll go up to the people and they'll do a few questions, and they'll sort of be heading off and they go, oh, and one final thing. And that's often the key question. There's some key information that they want to put across, or a key bit of information that they want to pick up. It's not that it's kind of to catch people off guard a little bit, but it's a key part that sort of goes, after all of these things that we've said, here's something that you really need to take notice of. And so I think we've got a slide up to tell us this first bit, leading into to what we want to talk about tonight. A final word. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armour so that you'll be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. So we've got all of this stuff that's gone on about relationships, about how we deal with each other, about the unity that's in the church. And Paul's saying, now just before you go though, before we close off here, here's something that you really need to take note of. This is a spiritual battle that you're involved in. This is not something that's necessarily going to come easy for you. So you need to stand firm against all of this. We're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, he says, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers of this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Well, it's kind of sounds heavy, doesn't it? Like it is really heavy. And I don't have time tonight to go into, there's probably a whole series of stuff that we could talk about there in terms of spiritual warfare. And I don't want to talk about the pros and cons of spiritual warfare or what it looks like or the ins and outs of all that stuff, just to say that I believe in it. I believe it's true. And that there are spiritual forces out there who are looking to take us down, who are looking to trip us up and looking to divert us off the course that God has placed us on. Sometimes they're really subtle and we don't realise that they're even there. Other times they're really bold and they're out there. Now, we sort of hear stories and, there's a lot of films. I've been watching this series over the last couple of days, and I'm not necessarily recommending it, I'm just saying that I've been watching it on Netflix called Warrior Nun. Has anyone seen it?
Watch the trailer.
Watch the trailer. It's kind of weird, but it's got these nuns that are fighting this sort of spiritual, sort of physical battle. But it's interesting that The girls haven't been watching it with me, that's why they're looking sort of... When have you been watching it?
I was hoping you were watching it, and I was like, what are you watching?
All right. Anyway, Hollywood likes to depict the spiritual battle with these horrible-looking demons that come out of nowhere, and someone's got to slay them somehow or other, and it's kind of this theme. Now, the thing is, though, that I do know a couple of people that say that they have seen or felt demons and evil forces in the room. We are not necessarily going to always feel those things in the room or see those things, but we need to recognise that they are there, that we are fighting against forces that are trying to pull us down and to trip us up. We're not fighting against flesh and blood, but against, as it said, the rulers, authorities and powers of this dark world and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. It tends to ebb and flow a little bit, the emphasis that we place on this in the church down through the years. I remember back in the 70s and early 80s, there was a really big push about spiritual warfare, and everybody was going to spiritual warfare schools and battle schools and all this sort of stuff, and there was a lot of prayer around deliverance ministry and all of that sort of stuff, and it tended to sort of drop off for a little while, and then it flares up again for a bit too. And it sort of reminds me that there was a book that was written a few years ago called The Screwtape Letters, and it was a fiction bit of work, but it was kind of written from a Christian perspective of this senior demon or devil who was writing to one of the juniors and giving him some advice about how to do his job properly. And it was really about giving advice to Christians about how to stand against the spiritual warfare. And at the start of the book, the guy that wrote it was C.S. Lewis, and he said that there's two traps that we can fall into in the world. One is that when we think about spiritual warfare, one is that we pay it too much attention and get distracted from the love and the good things that God has put in our world. And the other is that we don't think enough about it, and we just pretend it's not there. And so we need to sort of find a space somewhere in the middle where we recognise this stuff as real and we deal with it, but we don't make that everything that we do. We don't make that the central part of who we are. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we continue to look at this idea. So I want to give you a brief history of Ephesus. So there's another slide coming up there. Ephesus, you would have heard them before in that summary, said that it was a spiritual centre. There was this temple of Artemis, which was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It's this enormous temple, one of the biggest ones that would have been built anywhere in the world at that time. And so there were other various temples that was to the god or the goddess Artemis, who was around fertility and all of that sort of stuff. So there was temple prostitution and all of those sort of things. And there was real spiritual battles that were happening. So with all of this stuff and this huge temple and all of the stuff that went around that, you can imagine that there was spiritual battles that were happening on a daily basis, and that the people in Ephesus would have been aware of this spiritual stuff that was going on. And so it made sense that Paul would say to them, this stuff that we're fighting, it's not just about the people that are there. And if you remember the story from Acts, that's where some of the traders around Ephesus tried to kick Paul out of town because he was wrecking their business by throwing evil spirits out of people and bringing them back. There was one girl in particular who was prophesying on behalf of her masters and earning them lots of money, and he cast the demon out of her and they lost their income. So it wasn't just those sort of physical things, there was spiritual forces at work. And Paul said they need to be aware of those things, and they need to stand strong against those, because it'd be easy just to sort of run away and pretend that those things aren't there or put them in the too hard basket. But Paul says you need to stand strong against those things. So we come to then the armour of God. We recognise that there's this idea of spiritual battles that need to take place, and Paul gives this very well known picture, I guess, of the armour of God, this protective armour that we can put on. So I'm going to test you here. How many know what the pieces of the armour are? So yell them out. It's all right.
12.
Sorry?
12.
No, not how many. What are they? I think there's 12. I think you're thinking spiritual gifts. But what are the pieces of the armour?
Belt of Spirit.
Sorry?
Belt of Truth.
Belt of truth.
Sword of the Spirit.
Sword of the Spirit.
Helmet of Salvation.
Helmet of salvation. Now you're on the track there, Stephen. You're with us now. Breastplate of righteousness. Excellent.
Shoes of peace.
Shoes of peace. Shield of faith. I think that's all of them. I think there's 7. So, yeah, we said sword of the Spirit. So let's put them up there. Oh, that's good. Belt of truth, breastplate of righteousness, readiness of the gospel of peace. That's the shoes. Shield of faith, helmet of salvation, sword of the Spirit. I was interested too that in that little drawing again, I really love those. It just gave a couple of little things from Isaiah and said that these weren't new ideas that Paul had come up with. This was stuff that Isaiah had said hundreds of years earlier when he had looked towards the coming of the Messiah. And these are just the verses that they referred to about that. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. I think armour had probably changed a little bit from the time that Isaiah wrote this one to when Paul was writing his with the Romans around. Anyway, he made my mouth like a sharpened sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. So there's this sort of talk about armaments and shields and armour and all that sort of stuff. And then again in chapter 59, he put on righteousness as his breastplate and the helmet of salvation on his head. He put on the garments of vengeance and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. So you've got righteousness as both a belt and a breastplate there, but I'm not going to argue with Isaiah. He knows what he's talking about. But Paul takes those ideas and starts to flesh them out a little bit. Although it's interesting, when you look at these verses in Ephesians, he doesn't really go into a lot of detail about them. I think preachers down through the years have gone into mined these things for a lot of detail. It's been a great story for Sunday school because you can make little bits of armour from and shields and put little helmets on and all that sort of stuff. And it does start to teach kids and all of us that we are in this spiritual battle and we need to take this seriously. So let's go back to the armour of God though. The first one is we'll just leave those ones up there. The first is the belt of truth. And I just want to quickly go through each of these items tonight. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But interestingly, I've, like you, probably heard of a lot of people preach on these things down through the years. And I've seen some people that have talked about the fact that they every morning get up and put on the armour of God. And they physically do this. So they would go, I put on the belt of truth. And I place the breastplate, I'm going to say it properly one time, but the breastplate of righteousness on. And I place this helmet of... And so they physically go through this idea of covering themselves as they pray to prepare themselves for the day. And as we look at this, that might be something that you think about. But I want to think about what are the thoughts behind those bits of armour. So the first one is the belt of truth. This is a lot about discerning the truth as much as it is about telling the truth. The thing about the belt in the piece of armour is that it was the first thing that went on, and it was the thing on which everything else sort of hung off. So the breastplate was attached to it, there was the sword and everything sort of hung off the belt. It was a really central part of keeping everything together. And so it just tells us that truth is an important part of what we do. Not just telling the truth though. You know, we talked about love and truth this morning, and I talked about truth and respect in marriage and in relationships before. Truth is about recognising the truth of God's word, the truth of the gospel. All those sort of things are the truth. And we need to be seekers of truth. You know, so often these days we can fall for a lot of stories and lines that get told to us. And it is one of the big weapons of the devil. So if we're talking about spiritual warfare, the devil has been called at times the father of lies. And he's the one that will try to trick us into to believing something, giving us half-truths or untruths, or just trying to get us off course. It's not necessarily his job to put us to a complete turnaround, but just to get us off course and moving away from where God wants us. So we have to be seekers of the truth, and we have to know and recognise truth when we hear it. So it's really important to tell the truth and to be truthful in our dealings with people, but it's really important, more important in some ways, to know the truth and to recognise the truth and to act on the truth. The next bit is the breastplate of righteousness. So of course the breastplate sort of goes across the vital organs of your body, particularly your heart. So I guess my thought from putting on the breastplate of righteousness is about guarding your heart. And when we think about that, this is the place where, this is when we talk about allegiance. What are the things that are most important to us? Matthew said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so we need to be really careful that we guard our hearts. What are the things that are important to us? What are the things that matter most to us? Where is our heart? Where does it take us? Where does it lead us? In Proverbs, we read these words. Above all else, there's a slide. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. And this then follows on some of the thoughts that Paul shares in his various letters. Put away perversity from your mouth. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Make level paths for your feet, and take only ways that are firm. Do not swerve to the right or the left. Keep your foot from evil. So guard your hearts, the things that are important to you. Where are you placing your allegiance? What is the things that are most important to you? And make sure that your heart is given to God first and foremost, and that's where your allegiance lies. And then use that breastplate of righteousness, the righteousness that God gives us. It's something that we can't make for ourselves, but it's something that God gives us, and that protects our heart and shows us where to go. The next bit is about the shoes of the gospel of peace. Again, this is about, for me, I think, it's about being an active bringer of peace. You know, sometimes we try to be peacekeepers. And to be a peacekeeper, it really is, it's about not doing anything to upset people. It's about, keeping the peace. So we don't say things that might upset someone, or we don't do things that might cause a disruption or a disturbance, but we just live to keep things smooth and quiet all the way through. But a peace bringer actually sometimes needs to disrupt things. We used the quote from Catherine Booth last week about to make a better future, you need to disturb the present. And I think that's true with peace, that sometimes to bring peace, not just to keep peace, but to bring peace into situations, we need to disturb the status quo. We need to upset things a little bit. And so that's why it's nice that it's good that it's the shoes of the gospel of peace, because we go to where it is. We go to the places that need peace. It's not just hanging back and waiting for situations to come for us, but we go to a place that needs peace, and we take peace to those places. We step into the situations that are hard, that are difficult, and we bring peace. Not just our peace, not just a thing where we stop arguing or those sort of things, but the peace that only comes from knowing God. The peace that passes understanding. All those things about peace that we know from the various places that we find it. Jesus talked about peace. My peace I give you, he said. It's his gift that we can then share with others. But I think the really important thing for me, when I think about this armour of God, is that we go. It's a peace bringing, not just a peace keeping, that we put on this armour, and it's an active thing that we do. The next bit is the shield. So I've got a slide here that some various shields around the place. Now, so what's your favourite shield? Captain America. It is a very impressive shield. It's light. It's made of, what's it made of? Vibranium. That's great. Back in the old days, they didn't have vibranium, or they couldn't get to it so much. So Paul wouldn't have known about vibranium. But Roman shields, up the top left hand there, would have been wood, generally, sort of curved around on a thing with leather, hardened leather, or leather sort of put in front of it. Often they would, before a battle, they would douse it with water so that it was soft and pliable, and flaming arrows would come and get lodged in it and put out. There was important parts there. Now I put Hercules up there, and because his is an interesting shield, because there was other shields, and the Romans could do this as well, but not as effectively as the Spartans and some of the Greek shields from later on. So there's been a whole progression of shields down through the years. But they actually got to a stage where they would link them together. And shields become more effective in those battles, and particularly in those times, when they were linked together. So the Romans had this really cool way of standing together, sticking their sword through the gap between the shields, and then they would form this great line with the shields in front of them and over their heads. So the guys in the front line would stand holding their shield at the front. The guys behind them would have their shields above them and over their heads, so that they could move forward almost with impunity from slings and arrows and all that sort of stuff, and just go at people with that. So the shield was a weapon as much as it was just for protection. But the thing that we need to recognise with the shield is that we need to trust. We need to trust God, and we need to trust the others around us as well. So it's a really important thing here that to get the best protection, we need to shield each other. We need to shield ourselves and learn about shielding ourselves, but there's also this idea of shielding each other as well. Keep the faith, believe and trust in God and His protection for you. I think there's another slide there. Yes, there's the other shield that's very important for us to stand behind. All right, so that's a shield of faith. Keeping moving on. The helmet of salvation. I've got some helmets here as well. All right, so there's a variety of different helmets in place here. So we've got, Mads, you can tell us, Loki's helmet. All right. That is the most impractical helmet I have ever seen, ever. Like, you can't even use it to poke someone with. Like, the sharp bits are pointing in the wrong direction. So what are you going to do with a helmet like that? It's just going to pull you over. That's crazy. Anyway, so we've got our Roman helmet down the bottom there. Love the plumes, look very fancy. Not sure again how effective or what they were all about. Probably more to actually identify other people in the battlefield. So the guy with the bigger plumes would be the guy who's in charge. So you look to him for your directions and all that sort of stuff. Medieval helmets. I have no idea how they lived and fought in those sort of things, because how do you see what's going on? It's all very well to protect your noggin from someone, but if you can't see what you're doing, it seems a little bit crazy. And obviously my favourite helmet up the top there, and I am definitely a full face helmet person. I don't like the open ones. You might have seen a photo from last year, because you can just get lots of bugs and things in your mouth, and you get better protection from that. But the thing I want to say here is that when you get a helmet fitted, you need to get it fitted properly. It's not just a one-size-fits-all thing for helmets. Watch your thoughts. Watch your words. This is about your mind. Guard your thoughts. Guard your minds. And so we all come from different backgrounds. We have different ways of looking at the world. And the helmet of salvation suggests to me that we need to protect our mind. We talk about protecting our hearts and the things that are important to us. We need to protect our minds, our thoughts, and the way that we think about the world. And as I said, you need to get it fitted properly. Some of it's going to look, that protection, that salvation is not a one-size-fits-all, but God fits a salvation for you. He fits a helmet for you so that it works properly for you. I remember this thing that I read a number of years ago. I may have shared it before. Watch your thoughts, because they become your words. To guard our minds against that, against wrong thoughts. Romans chapter 12 verse 2 says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And Colossians chapter 3 verse 2 says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. So it's important for us to guard our thoughts and guard our minds. The last one is the sword of the Spirit. Now, again, I've got some examples here. What sort of sword do you think we're talking about here? So we've got Russell Crowe's little sword, we've got katana that Tom Cruise used, or is it more a lightsaber? Is that really a sword? I'm not sure. What sort of sword do you think is that Paul might be talking about? Obviously he didn't know about the katana, that was in Japan, so he was on the other side of the world. And he didn't know about lightsabers, they hadn't been invented yet. But he would have known there was a couple of different Roman swords, and there was different styles of sword. There was broadswords that were long, heavy things that were really used to clonk people on the head with as much as cut things with. And there was the short ones that were more a stabbing sort of sword. There's all different ways. And again, it just fits in again with this idea, for me, that it's not a one-size-fits-all for this armour. Do you remember the story of David when he fought Goliath? Saul said to him, "Here, put my armour on and that will protect you." And he goes, "That's crazy, it's just not my size." And so he went out and found his own way of protecting himself. But I don't want to draw that analogy too far, other than to say that not all armour is not a one-size-fits-all. We have to think about the different pieces and the different styles that fit with us. So what is the sword of the Spirit? What kind of sword can you use? It's not about your own enlightenment. It's about knowing God's word. The sword of the Spirit is the word of God. It's about knowing that word, knowing how to apply it. It's knowing where to apply it. So, sometimes for that sword, it's a jabbing sort of sword. Sometimes it's a swiping sword. So sometimes we need to use the word just to remind people about something. Sometimes we need to use the word to point people in a different direction. But to know the word, or to use the word, we need to know the word. And so Paul says you need to know God's word and know how to use it. Not to just bash other people with, by the way, but to use it to help people to understand. So can we go back to that original slide about the bits there? There, that one. That's the one. The armour of God. So we've got truth, we've got righteousness, we've got the gospel of peace, we've got the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit. All that refer to different parts of our lives and different parts of our relationship with God. And to recognise that we need protection in those things. We need a spiritual protection. We need to know this stuff and stand strong against the wiles of the devil. These are all protections for us against the way that the devil will try to trip us up. So we need to know this stuff, and we need to be able to use those things in its place in the right time. So again, as I said, I've heard some people say that you can put those bits of armour on at the start of each day. It's a good way to think about what the day is going to hold for you and what you need to be aware of as you go forward. So today I'm looking at some stuff that's going to be happening. So I really need the belt of truth. I need to be able to recognise truth when it comes, when it's presented to me today. I need the breastplate of righteousness because I could easily be led astray by some of the things that are happening. I'm off to do this, and this is a really important thing for me, but it could waylay me from the actual place where you want me to go, Lord. I'll put on the helmet of salvation because I would easily get distracted. My thoughts can be led astray. So help me to focus on you. Help me to celebrate the salvation that you bring me. But help me to live in that way. The shield of faith. Help me to hold on to that, to rest behind that when I need to move forward with it when I need to. Help me to be a bringer of peace, the gospel of peace. Help me to put the shoes of bringing the gospel of peace to people. And you can just work through all those things and say, what is it that you really need me to know today and where you want to lead me in those things. So remember that we are in a spiritual battle and that God calls us to stand strong in those things. And in some place it says, and when you've done everything else, to continue to stand. So even to the point of exhaustion, God has provided us with these protections and these weapons that will help us to get through, and to recognise that it's not just us that does it on our own, that these are spiritual things that we can put on that help us to stand firm in those times. Finally, we get to this last bit. So we'll go back to, there we go. Paul has kind of finished his message to the church at Ephesus now. I like the idea that it was, as I said, that there's that spiritual stuff at the end. There's all of those things there, he says, but you need to be, just this final point, keep this in mind, that it's a spiritual battle that we're in, and these are the weapons or the tools that God provides you to do that. But just before I go, it's almost this, and one last little thing. Will you pray for me, he says. Pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Stay alert, be persistent in your prayers for all believers everywhere. And pray for me too. Ask God to give me the right words so that I can boldly explain God's mysterious plan, that the good news is for Jews and Gentiles alike. Going back to where he started this letter. I'm in chains now, still preaching the message as God's ambassador. So pray that I will keep on speaking boldly for him, as I should. Well, I think the thing that we need to get out of that is that it's important to pray for each other. Paul recognised that. He prayed for them at the start of the letter. He enunciated his prayer. He laid it out for them and said, this is what I'm praying for you. I thank God for you, and this is what I'm praying for you. And now he sort of finishes off and says, will you pray for me too? This is what I need Ask God to give me the right words so that I can boldly explain God's mysterious plan, that the good news is for Jews and Gentiles alike. And he says, pray for each other, and he says, pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Be persistent in your prayers for all believers. And I think that's really, he then does a couple of little greetings and says, say good day to the people down there. I'm sending Tychicus down there to see you. Say hi to him for me. And this is a lovely personal touch on at the end of the letter there. But this bit is really good because it says, pray for each other, pray for your leaders, and ask for prayer. It's all right to ask for prayer. Like if Paul can ask for prayer, surely all of us should be asking for prayer as well. Let's not just sit back and go, I hope someone prays for me. I hope someone will know what's going on. When situations arise that you need prayer, go and ask someone to pray for you. Find someone that you trust. Find someone that you know is linked in with all this stuff and ask them to pray for you. And the blessing that you get from that will at times surprise you, because there's real power in praying for each other and praying for our leaders and praying for others around us. So we're going to finish this little section